Okay, here we go. This is the second exam that we will run through. I'll try to break this up again into videos of roughly half an hour apiece to make them manageable for you, I hope. So let's go over the January 28th, 2015 exam. We did June 2015, which was last year's. Let's do last January's, just before that. Okay. So, once again, we start with multiple choice. Base your answers to questions 1 and 2 on the graph below and on your knowledge of social studies. Alright, so they give you the graph. They love to give you graphs. Shipping tonnage on the Erie Canal. Now, see Erie Canal, you should think, this is what's shipping farm goods from the Midwest across upstate New York to the Hudson and out the port of New York to the rest of the world. The Erie Canal is what made the Midwest useful for farmland, encouraged settlement because farmers could move out there, ship their stuff out, make a lot of money. It also turned the port of New York into the main port out of New York, out of the United States, in and out of the United States. Okay, 1830 to 1860. 1836 is, of course, when the canal opens. 1860, now we notice that's Civil War. Wonder why they stopped with 1860 with this chart. Maybe because by the 1860s, canals are beginning to be replaced by railroads. Interesting. Anyway, okay, tonnage. So how many tons and thousands of tons are shipped? 0, 125 up to 2,500 tons, 1836 to 1860. Okay, so you start in 1836 with just 375 tons, and then it climbs hugely, and okay, bump, but then climbs hugely, and then bump, and then climbs again. Okay. That's tonnage from the west to New York City, so from the farms shipping out. Tonnage from New York City to the west, going the other direction. You see it starts at nothing and then climbs slowly, never gets as big, nearly as big. Why? Because the farmers are growing stuff, putting it out, and then shipping it to the rest of the world to sell. They're not importing a lot of stuff. Okay. So let's see. What's the question that they ask? Information on the graph clearly supports the conclusion that the Erie Canal did what? Improved transportation between the Hudson River and the Great Lakes. That's the point of the Erie Canal. You could put stuff in your farm on the Great Lakes, cross the Erie Canal to the Hudson, down the Hudson to New York City. If you look at this, slowed migration to the west, to the Midwest. No, the Erie Canal actually increased migration to the Midwest. Farmers moved out there because now they could make money. Replaced railroads as the main method of transportation. Just the opposite. The canals came first, the railroads came later. Relied on the development of steamboats for canal use. Not really. If you look here, the canal was in use from 1836 on. You don't get a bump because of steamboat usage. One of the nice things about canals is that you don't depend on the flow of water in them, so you don't need a steamboat to push you upstream. One major result of the completion of the Erie Canal was what? New York City became the nation's commercial center. Since the canal took you to the Hudson, and the point of the Hudson was to get you to New York City became the main port shipping stuff to the rest of the world. None of the rest of this makes sense. Okay. Question 3. Which factor most influenced the economic development of the colonial South? So back in the colonies, when the South gets settled, what was the biggest thing? Abundant water, power for manufacturing. No, wrong. Why? South was never big about manufacturing. South was always about farming. Rich deposits of iron, ore, and coal. A, South was never big about coal and iron, and B, in the colonies, this is the 1700s, we're pre-industrial revolution. They don't care a lot about iron and coal. Plentiful forests. Well, the South is those big plantations. You don't have forests on plantations. Warm and wet growing seasons. Ah, there you go. Remember, colonial South is big about tobacco, and then eventually would switch over to cotton. For those you need warm growing seasons. So number 2 is the correct answer. Okay, base your answer to question 4 on this passage. John Peter Zenger, 1734. You see, this is where this comes from. John Peter Zenger. The minute you see that name, Zenger, you should think freedom of the press. John Peter Zenger writes, the jury withdrew, and in a small time returned, and being asked by the clerk whether they were agreed of their verdict, and whether John Peter Zenger was guilty of printing and publishing the libels in the information mentioned. They answered by Thomas Hunt, their foreman, not guilty. Upon which there were 3 huzzahs, think of that as hoorays, in the hall, which was crowded with people. The next day I was discharged from my imprisonment. Okay. So he's writing about his own court case, where he was charged with libel for printing criticisms of the royal governor. The jury finds him not guilty. The court case discussed in the passage was important in the development of colonial America, because it helped establish the principle of freedom of the press. Even before there was the United States, freedom of the press was a fundamental idea in the colonies in America. Again, Zenger case. I keep saying this because they like to ask about the Zenger case. Okay. Question 5, sorry. The social contract theory was used in the Declaration, as used in the Declaration of Independence, was most directly influenced by the writings of John Locke. When you see social contract in the Regents exam, you should think John Locke. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, but he's copying almost word for word from the works of John Locke. 6. Under the Articles of Confederation, the years between 1781 and 1787 are often referred to as the critical period. What's to remember about the Articles of Confederation? The very first government of the United States, when we first declare independence, is under this document called the Articles of Confederation. Remember, it's about a weak central government. The Articles of Confederation has no president. It has no Supreme Court. It has only the Congress. And even the Congress can't do anything unless it acts unanimously. And how often are you going to get a unanimous vote? The Articles of Confederation made the national government so weak it couldn't function. And that was why the new United States got together after just a few years and said, this is not working anymore. We have to start over. And they wrote a new document, the U.S. Constitution, to fix that problem and give us a national government that was strong enough to function. They like to ask this kind of question. Articles of Confederation is referred to as the critical period because the central government lacked the power to deal with major problems. Question 7. Which power regarding the federal judiciary was established in Marbury versus Madison? court case, Marbury v. Madison, when you see that, you should think instantly judicial review, and specifically that means that the U.S. Supreme Court has the ultimate say over whether a law or an action by the president is constitutional. So the power, federal judiciary, that's the courts, established in Marbury-Madison, that federal laws may be declared unconstitutional. Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, important guy. He was the guy who pushed hardest to get the U.S. Constitution written, to give us a strong central government, and to create this Bank of the United States, a national bank. Why? Because Alexander Hamilton was all about business. He believed that business was the future of America, that we wouldn't just be a nation of small farmers, but we'd be a nation of commerce, business, trade. To do that, you need a strong central government giving you stability, and you need a national bank that gives you a stable currency and organized financial system. So, Alexander Hamilton supported the Bank of the United States because it would help ensure the economic stability of the new nation. Stability is good for business. Number 9. George Washington's leadership during the Whiskey Rebellion. Okay. Very important. They like to ask this one too. George Washington becomes President of the United States. Shortly after he becomes president, there is this event called the Whiskey Rebellion. Handful of guys out by Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who don't like paying the new federal tax on whiskey. And so they stage this little rebellion. It's not very much. It's not a big deal. You don't have a lot of people killed, but they have this kind of riot. Washington sends the army from the new national government that puts the Whiskey Rebellion down quickly and efficiently. Who cares? It proves that the new national government under the new Constitution is now going to be strong enough to deal with the nation's problems, and we can all be satisfied with that. So it showed the ability of the new government to enforce federal law. And that, again, creates stability, and people can get on with their lives. Okay, question 10. Major result of the Supreme Court decisions McCulloch v. Maryland and Gibbons v. Ogden. Okay. They don't usually ask about the details of these court cases, these two court cases. So here's what you want to remember. They expand the power of the federal government. I mentioned them to you. McCulloch v. Maryland. That's about the national bank that Alexander Hamilton set up. The state of Maryland didn't like it, and so they tried to tax it. The Supreme Court said that the Congress has the power to create a national bank. In the U.S. Constitution, it doesn't say anything about the Congress having that power. But it does say that Congress can regulate the money and that it can do everything, quote, necessary and proper to accomplish that. That necessary and proper clause is vague. It's stretchy. It's called the elastic clause because you can stretch it to fit what you need. Gibbons v. Ogden was a case, if you remember, about the ferry across the Hudson River. There were two guys running a ferry across the Hudson between New York State and New Jersey. One guy got a license from New York State, And New York State said, you're the only guy that can run a ferry. The other guy ran a ferry anyway. The case wound up in the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said New York can't interfere with interstate commerce. As long as you're crossing a state line, neither New York nor New Jersey can do anything about it. The only people who can do anything about it is the national government, the Congress, and therefore the states can't stop this guy from running a ferry. That's the Interstate Commerce Clause that says that only Congress can regulate interstate commerce. Those two clauses, the Elastic Clause and the Interstate Commerce Clause, are both ways that the court expanded the power of the Congress. So the powers of the federal government were expanded. They like to ask that question. They will use the terms. Watch. They will talk about the Elastic Clause, which is the same thing as the Necessary and Proper Clause. Congress has certain enumerated powers, listed powers, specific, explicit powers, and all other powers necessary and proper to accomplish those. The Supreme Court has used that Elastic Clause to expand the power of the federal government. McCulloch v. Maryland and Gibbons v. Ogden are important examples of that. Okay. Timeline. 1803, Louisiana Purchase, established western boundary of the United States. Okay. So, again, Jefferson doubles the size of the country, negotiates a treaty with France to buy it. 1808, Convention with Britain established northern boundary of Louisiana Territory. Convention, kind of treaty with Britain, because the problem was, you probably don't remember this, but we talked about, where does the Louisiana Purchase stop? Like, where does Canada start and the United States stop at the top north of the Louisiana Purchase? That had to be worked out by treaty. 1819, Adams-Onis Treaty gave Florida to the United States. England basically traded it to us. Spain basically traded it to us. 1842, Webster-Ashburton Treaty establishes the border with Canada up in Maine. 1846, Treaty of Oregon established the northern boundary of the Oregon Territory that later became the state of Oregon and the state of Washington. That's all about, again, where Canada starts. Okay, so now what's the question? The timeline shows that the major way the U.S. gained territory in the early 19th century was through what? War? No, these are all treaties. There's no wars here. Executive orders? Simply orders from the president? No, because it's all agreements with foreign countries. Arbitration? No, arbitration, fancy word for a kind of court decision. Diplomacy. We sent our ambassadors, we worked out a treaty, and we solved the problem. Diplomacy, number 2, correct answer. In the 1830s, President Andrew Jackson supported the Indian removal policy. Why? Simple. White settlers wanted the land on which Native Americans lived. Really, after the United States gets started, once we become our country, that's the real reason that the U.S. keeps taking Native American lands. It's because as white settlers discover more and more land, as they push west, in the case of Andrew Jackson, they were simply still down in Georgia. The Indian land in Georgia was good farmland, and white settlers simply wanted it. So Andrew Jackson, if you remember, the Cherokee Nation in Georgia lived on a big chunk of property. The state of Georgia wanted the land to give to white settlers. It turned out to be very good farmland. The Indians didn't want to move. They said, we don't care, state of Georgia. We have a treaty with the United States of America. The nation of the Cherokee has a treaty with the nation of the United States that this is our land. They take their case to the Supreme Court, a case called Worcester v. Georgia, and the Supreme Court says, you're right, you Cherokee. Andrew Jackson, who's the president, says, I don't care what the court says. I'm going to move you anyway. And so he forces them to go west all the way, halfway across the country, to the Indian Territory, which is the modern state of Oklahoma. That's called the Trail of Tears. So that's what it was all about, white settlers wanting that land. And once again, will they ask about Indian removal? Yeah, in some way. They could mention this case of Worcester v. Georgia, which is in the notes that I gave you. They could talk about the Trail of Tears. They could talk about Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy. It could come up in any of those ways. Okay, question 13. Oh, here we go, picture. They love to throw pictures on. So what have we got here? Okay. The westward course of empire takes its way. That's the name of this painting. It's a famous painting. And what do we got? Well, you're looking at the painting, so you're going from the east to the west. You see the brave pioneers there pointing to the west, waving their hats on horseback. There's the covered wagons going out there, charging across. The westward course of empire takes its way, like they have a right to this somehow, that this is something that they have a duty or a destiny for. Okay, so there's the picture. And 1861, we see the date down there. The guy who painted it was this Emanuel Leutze. It's a German name. 1861, okay, great. That's just the start of the Civil War, middle of the 1800s. Question, what point of view is being conveyed by the artist? Obviously, praise for manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is that idea that existed from the 1840s on, that the United States was meant, given destiny by God, to go all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In the 1840s, it motivated the Mexican War. Remember, Texas had left Mexico. Texas was a part of Mexico. The Texans had rebelled, left Mexico, become their own Republic of Texas, asked to join the United States as a state, became a state. The question was, where was the border of Texas? That wasn't clear. So Mexico thought it was one place. The United States thought it was the Rio Grande. We send, the President James Knox Polk sends the U.S. Army to the Rio Grande to say, we claim all of Texas. Mexico fights us, and in the Mexican War, the United States conquers the whole southwest of the United States. What's now Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and California. And we just take it, and all of a sudden the U.S. is coast to coast. And then after that, that's the 1840s. By the 1860s, it's about filling all that in, sending the settlers in to fill in this land that we have a right to. So that's all manifest destiny. They will ask a question about manifest destiny. Okay. Base your answers to questions 14 and 15 on the speaker's statements below and your knowledge of social studies. All right, so Speaker A says, the right way to settle the question of slavery in the territories. The territories, remember, those areas that are not yet organized as states. Are they going to be slave or are they going to be free? Well, Speaker A says it's to let the people there determine if their state is to be slave or free. Remember, that was called at the time popular sovereignty. We'll let them vote. Speaker B says, Supreme Court in Dred Scott versus Sanford is exactly what this country needs. Dred Scott, remember, was the Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court said, once you're a slave, you can never be free. No black man has any rights anybody needs to respect. And if a slave comes north into the free states, even if his master brings him there, he doesn't get his freedom. Speaker C says secession, that is, leaving the country, is unlawful and treasonous. Everything possible must be done to preserve the Union. Speaker D, the rights of the states must be protected. The federal government is exceeding its authority. All right. Solution proposed by Speaker A is known as popular sovereignty. Let the people exercise their right to rule the new territories, sovereigns, and vote. Which speaker most accurately represents the opinions of Abraham Lincoln? What did Lincoln say? Lincoln was not in favor of popular sovereignty. He believed in a thing called free soil. He said, let's leave slavery alone in the South for now. He was not a fan of slavery, but he said, we'll leave it alone in the South for now. Let's just not make any more slave states. So he wouldn't have agreed with Speaker A. Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott, he wouldn't have agreed with Speaker B. Lincoln was not a fan of slavery. He was not a supporter of it. The rights of the states must be protected. Federal government is exceeding its authority. No, Lincoln believed that the federal government was the ultimate government of the country. Southern states thought that each individual state should get to make all of its own rules. Lincoln was not in favor of that. So C is the correct answer. Secession is unlawful and treasonous. Everything must be done to preserve the Union. When the Southern states seceded, Lincoln went to war in the Civil War, of course, because he said they don't have a right to simply opt out of the country. That's treason against the United States. So C is the correct answer there. The Black Codes were established in the South immediately after the Civil War in an effort to do what? To limit the rights of newly freed African Americans. The Black Codes, which also give us that Jim Crow era, were the ones that the 13th Amendment gave slaves their freedom. The 14th Amendment said that the newly freed slaves are citizens and entitled to equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. All happens right after the Civil War. Southern states say, yeah, well, okay, we can't stop them from voting because they're black, so we'll stop people from voting because they can't read. Well, few of the blacks could read because it had been illegal to educate them. We'll stop people from voting because they can't pay a tax at the polls. Well, the blacks were mostly poor, so they couldn't pay. We'll stop people from voting because if their grandfather couldn't vote. Well, no newly freed slave had a grandfather who could vote. So they enact all these crazy laws to try to keep the newly freed blacks from actually using any of their new freedom. Okay. Let's do 17 here. Base your answer to question 7020, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we have 4 speakers again. Speaker A. Government should not interfere with business. The market will regulate itself over time. Successful businesses will remain, while inefficient ones will be eliminated. Speaker A is laissez-faire. Government should not interfere with business. Speaker B. Inequalities resulting from unregulated capitalism are too vast. The individual worker and consumer are at the mercy of business owners. The government must do something to protect the people. Speaker B would be a progressive. Guys like Teddy Roosevelt, who said, we have to have the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up those monopolies. We have to have the Meat Inspection Act. Speaker B would be one of those people. Speaker C. Government should own and manage the principal manufacturing and transportation and banking industries. Speaker C is a socialist. Government ownership of major businesses. Speaker D. Workers should control the industries in which they work. Profits should be shared equally among them. That Speaker D really is a communist with a small c. Not communist like Soviet Union, but the idea of philosophical communism, that the workers themselves should own all the businesses. What action by the federal government was a step toward the approach to business favored by Speaker B? Speaker B, okay, we can read that. Speaker B, we said, was one of those progressives, so Speaker B would have been in favor of the Sherman Antitrust Act. That was about saying, you know, if one company owns an entire industry, that's not healthy for anybody. The government should step in and bust it up. Which speaker is expressing a viewpoint that is most consistent with the principles of laissez-faire? As we said, that's Speaker A. Government should not interfere with business. Okay. 18. 19. Apache children on arrival at Carlisle Indian School, Pennsylvania. The Carlisle Indian School is one of the famous Indian schools set up specifically for Native Americans. 1886. So we see them. And as you can see, they've got those really boss haircuts there, right? Long, shaggy, tribal style hair. This guy is kind of dressed in something like Native American garb. Yeah, they look a little bit ragtaggy. This guy has got the headband there, which was common for Apache tribe in particular. Okay, now we look at the same group of kids over here. 4 months later, just 4 months later, at the same school, same group of kids. And what do you see? Well, first of all, they've all got haircuts. Second, they're all in, it looks like army uniforms, but they're really the sort of school uniforms of the time. The girls you see are in sort of the typical dresses that would have been common at the time. Now, what is the point here? Well, the Carlisle Indian School was a school set up basically to turn Native American kids into white kids. So they weren't permitted to use their native Apache language. They weren't permitted to dress tribal style. They couldn't, all of the customs and the family customs and the rituals and so on, they weren't allowed to do. They had to follow white ways and be assimilated, part of white society. Okay. The pair of photographs suggest that the major purpose of the Carlisle Indian School was to do what? Promote cultural assimilation. Get them to drop their Indian culture and adopt white man's culture. They like to ask a question about this sort of thing too. Okay. I'm going to leave it there with question 19. Next video we'll pick up with question 20.